Hey guys, welcome to part 4 and the final part of our JSON Server series. In this part, we're going to be putting everything we've learned so far into practice by building a little project with JSON Server. Alright, so let's take a look at what our project is going to look like when we're finished with it. So as you can see, it's called York University Students, since all our data is about students. Now, the first thing we see is we see all our 5 students that are in our db.json file. We can see right now their name, major, and a little link called student details. So if we click on that, we will see a bit more information about them, such as their email and year of birth. All right, and that works for every student. Now, we can delete students by clicking on this X. So let's delete Stephanie, for example. There we go, she's gone. We can also add a student by clicking this button here. So let's add a student here. Let's call him James Bond. And his major will be kicking butt. And if we click submit, we can see our student added at the bottom. Great, so that works. Now we can also sort students alphabetically, and we'll see that they're all sorted by alphabet. And we can also filter them by major. So let's say we have 2 psychology students. So if we filter by psychology, we should see 2 students. And there we go. And we can also see our kinesiology student and our biology student, etc. And if you want to go back to the original screen, you just have to click refresh. And there we go. Okay, so everything we're going to do here, you should be familiar with from previous videos in this series. Now, I will not be going into depth for obvious reasons when it comes to HTML, CSS, and the base JavaScript, since this is not our focus in this video. But you will have the starter files that you'll be able to download. So if you go to this repo here, JSON Server project, I will leave a link to the repo in the description to the video. Then you can go to the drop-down menu here and you can click on starter files. And then you can go here and you can either download the zip of the files or clone them through CLI. And that's it. So once you have the starter files downloaded, make sure to open them in your code editor and you'll be able to follow along with the project. So just before we start working with our code, let's just go over the logic that we're going to have to implement here to make all this functionality that we saw. And this is going to be a good review for you as well of the information we learned in previous videos. So first of all, to get all our students, if you recall, we're going to have to do a GET request to localhost 3000/students, which is our resource. To get these student details, we're going to do another GET request, this time to /students/ the ID of the student. To sort our students alphabetically, we're going to have to do another GET request to /students, and then we're going to have to enter our query string or a query parameter. To filter the students, it's also a GET request, this time to with a different parameter at the end. Major equals psychology if we want to filter by psychology, for example. All right, and then to add a student, this is going to be a different type of request. Can you remember what type that is? Well, it's going to be a post request to /students. And finally, to delete a student, we're going to have to do a delete request to /students/ the ID of the student we want to delete. So this is the logic we're going to have to implement in our code. So let's start doing that next. Alright guys, so once you've downloaded the starter files, that once again you can get from the link to my GitHub page, which you can find in the video description. Once you have them downloaded, please go ahead and open them in your code editor. Now, I've done that in Visual Studio Code, which is my code editor. So I'm going to show you the initial setup that we have here in terms of code. All right. Now, before I do that, let me just point out that I am using an extension called Live Server, which basically allows me to live reload the web browser every time I save my code. So I definitely suggest that you have something like this as well. It just makes things a lot easier. So that's really the most important extension that I think is worth mentioning. Okay, so let's take a look at our initial code here. So we're going to go from the top down. So first we have an image folder with two images here. The first one is just our favicon, and the other one is the logo for our university. Next, we have our db.json file, which you should be familiar with. We've worked with this data in the previous videos. Next, we have our index.html. So let's look at this one briefly. We have a link here to our style.css, which is this file here. What else? We have our header here, which is the top section. We have an image link here and the name of our university right here. Next, we have a wrapper. So this is the wrapper for all the visible content on our website. Okay, at the top, we have div with a class top buttons menu. So that is the buttons that we saw that have our options to filter students or add a student, etc. Let me actually show this so you can see what I'm talking about, just to remind you. So we're going to launch our JSON server first. Now, I'm going to launch mine a bit differently than I showed you before because I have mine installed globally. So if you want to install it globally like me, all you have to do is say npm install JSON server, and then you can add the G flag. And that's going to install it globally, and you'll be able to run it from anywhere, right? Which is how I'm going to be doing it here. So let me just start up my JSON server. So I'm just going to say JSON server watch and db.json. Okay, and there we go. It's serving our student data. And now I'm just going to go ahead and go live, which, by the way, you can also do this by just right-clicking on your index page and clicking on Open with Live Server. I'm using a little shortcut here at the bottom. If you see at the bottom right, it'll have an option here to go live. So that's what I was using. Anyway, so this is right now what our project looks like. Okay, remember we're missing a lot of important code here, but we're going to just use it as a reference. So let's go back to our HTML. So as I was saying, we have our div with top buttons menu. So that is for all the buttons in here. Next, we have another div below that, which is currently empty. It has an ID of student list. And as you can guess, this is where we'll be outputting our student data. Let's continue down. Here we have code for our add student modal. So remember, when we want to add a student, we're going to click on this button, and it's going to pop up our model. Okay, so that's the code for this model here. And below that, we have another model for the student details. So that's the one when you click on the little button on each student, and it'll give you all the information about the student. Okay, and at the bottom, we're also linking to our script.js, which is our JavaScript file here. And that's pretty much it for our index.html. So let's move on. we have our, actually, let me talk about the style first before we get into the JavaScript. So CSS. So I'm importing a font here from Google. I have some initial resets here, some styling for the body. For the header, we're just giving it some margin and display flags. A header image, adjusting it as well. This is, again, the wrapper for the visible part of our website. So I'm just giving it a background color, as you saw, of this kind of light blue, giving it some padding, width, and height of fit content. Now, the purpose of this is that when we add more students, we want our wrapper to expand, right? So that's why we have fit content here. We have our top button styling here. So we're just giving them text align center, some padding, width. Now this is actually, sorry, it's not for the buttons. That's actually for the container of the button. So that's for this right here, top buttons menu, right? For the menu itself. And here, this is for the actual buttons. So we're just styling them a little bit, make them look nicer. Filter by major button. Yeah, that's this one here. I had to style it individually just because it's a drop-down button. It's a little bit different from these ones. All right, so our student class. So this is actually styling for the students that we're going to be outputting, right? So remember how before we saw how our students are going to look displayed here. So each of those boxes, if you will, of the student, that's what the styling is for, okay, to make the box look nice. Student span. So this is for the X button when we want to delete a student. Again, we're going to see this after we display our students. Right now, we're not actually doing that yet. Details button, and this is just copyright at the bottom. And here we have a styling for our add student model. Basically, this is more or less standard styling when you need to create a model. So feel free to look through this if you're interested. I'm not going to get into this too much. But essentially, it ends over here. And then here we have styling for the student details model as well, which is much smaller. All right. So that's an overview of the style.css. And now let me just exit these. And right now, let's look at our main file, which we'll be working with, which is script.js. Okay. Now, I've already, as I mentioned, I've added a lot of data to here because I don't want to spend a lot of time just on the JavaScript, right? We want to focus on code that's actually connected to the topic of our series, which is JSON Server, right? But let me go through this with you briefly. So first of all, we have reference to our DOM elements here. So I've organized these into buttons. We have 4 of those, our 2 models, and this is for miscellaneous. So student list, form and student details box. So if you're curious what they are, just look at the ID here and look at the HTML and you see what it refers to. All right, so we got our DOM elements here. Now at the bottom, I put my functions first here. So this is where we're going to be writing our functions for getting the different student data. And I've already kind of gave them a little bit of comments, so everything is a bit more organized for us. And then after the functions, I have event listeners. All right, so some of these event listeners are already filled out. Again, these are the ones that are not really directly related to our topic. And the other ones that say enter code here, that's what we're going to be doing together. But let me just briefly explain these ones that are already completed. So this is for the add a student model button. So what's happening is when we click on the button, it's going to make our modal visible, right? So we're setting visibility to visible. And so button open modal, that's this one right here, okay? Sometimes it helps to just search for it quickly. All right, oh yes, so that's the one that we have here. when we click Add Student. So, okay, so we're making our model visible upon clicking the button. Here we have, this is for closing the model. So we're basically looking for the target, and then we're setting a condition. If a target has a certain name, we need to close the model. So basically, that is the functionality that we get when we open the model and we want to close it. We can either click on the outside of the model here, so this little backdrop, or we can click on the button, and either of these will close the model. Okay, and we have the same thing later on for student details information, which is right here. Okay, so that's it for the overview, and in the next section, let's go ahead and start coding. Alright guys, so the first thing we want to do in our code is we want to basically fetch all the student data and display it right here below the buttons, right? So how do we do that? Well, let's go back to our code, to the script.js file, and we're going to scroll down here to our event listeners. Now, if you think about it, we want the students to display when our web page loads, right? So to do that, we need to use an event listener called DOM content loaded. All right. So basically, once all our content has loaded, this is when this event listener fires, and then it's going to do whatever we type in here. And what we want to type in here is we want to actually to initiate our function called fetch students. All right. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So let's type in fetch students. And we're going to type in the URL where we want to fetch. So that's going to be our argument in here. And we can just copy it right from here and paste it in here. So remember, to get all our students, we just want to go to this URL here, ending in our resource name, which is students. Okay, and that's as easy as that. So now our first piece of code is complete. And next, we're going to go up to our fetch students function here. And here we're going to have to write how to handle the data that we fetch. So how do we do this? Well, first, let's observe here that this is an asynchronous function. So whenever we fetch data, we use asynchronous functions. Now, if you don't know how to work with async functions, feel free to do a bit of research about this, or you can just simply see what I'm doing here. I'm sure you'll find it helpful. So what we need to do first is we need to type in a constant. We're going to call it res, or result, equals to await fetch URL. All right, so what does this mean? Well, it means that after our URL is fetched, we want to take that data and we want to store it in a variable called res. Okay, that's all we're doing here. All right, next, we're going to create another variable. We're going to call it, well, we could call it data, or I'm just going to go call it students because that's the type of data we're going to get. And here we're going to await res.json. So once we have the res variable, then we're going to basically apply a method, a JSON method to it. And what that does is it takes the data, which is in JSON format, and it converts it to a JavaScript object. And it stores it in our students variable here. Good. Next thing we're going to do, well, I'm just format it a little bit. So next thing we need to do is we need to start up our template, because we're going to be outputting this student's data somehow, right? So let's just start by saying let HTML equals, I'm going to just give it empty quotes, and we're going to be filling these very soon with something. So now we need to run a function for all the data in our students variable. So for each student in our data, we want to do something. We want to output some kind of template. So let's type in students, and we're going to use a function, or a method I should say, called for each. So I'm using arrow functions here. Now, what do we want to do for each student? Well, we want to create a template, an HTML template. So I'm going to reference this variable here once again, HTML, and we're going to add to it. Okay, so HTML, I'm going to say add to whatever is there, and we're going to use a template literal here. So if you've never heard of template literal, you basically want to use back quotes, which in most keyboards is a button to the left of number 1 or to on top of tab key. All right, so we want to use that, and here we're going to enter our template, so our HTML code. So I'm going to start by typing in a div and giving it a class of student. Remember, we talked about this class when we looked at our CSS, so we already gave it styling. Oops, student. Good, and let's actually close the div right away. And inside, we want to, first of all, let's give it a span tag and give that a class of delete student. So remember, this is going to be the X button that will let us delete the student when we click it. And to create an X, we're just going to type in a character here called times. You could also put an X if you like, but I prefer this character here. All right, and let's close the tag. Next, we're going to have an H3, so a heading, and this is where we're going to put the student's name. So here, because we used backticks here, right, for our template literal, we can actually use this little template for our variable. Okay, so $, and these curly brackets, and here we're going to type in student. Oops. Student.name. Okay, so we're pulling out the property of name from our student, from each of our students in our data. Okay, so let's close the tag. So we have our student name. Next thing, if you recall, we want to output the major of the student. So let's do that in a p tag. I'm just going to say major. And here again, let's use a template here, and we're going to say student.major. Close the p tag. Next, we're going to have a button. That is the details button that we can click. So let's give it a class of details button. And here we're going to say student details. Excellent. And then we also want to do something tricky here. Again, there's more than one way to do this, but I decided to do it in this way. I'll explain it a little bit later. For now, let's just type it after me. So hidden class equals ID. So basically, we're giving this P a class, but it's also hidden. So we're not actually going to see this P, all right, this paragraph. It's going to be invisible for us. And once again, it'll become clear later why we're doing this. And here we want to output our student ID. So student.id. Great. So now that our HTML template is complete, so we're doing this kind of template for each of our students. Remember, right now in our DB.json we have 5 students. Okay, so that's what we're doing on all of those 5 students. And the last thing we need to do is we need to actually output this in our student list div. All right, so how do we do that? Well, we're going to go underneath here, and we're just going to say student list. Remember, we already referenced this div here. Where is it? Student list right here. So we're just using this variable name. I'm going to say student list dot inner HTML equals to HTML. So we're putting everything that's in this variable right now that we've accumulated in the HTML variable, we're outputting it in our student list. So let's save that. Perfect. And now if we go back, we will see that all our students are here. Excellent. So we've completed the first part of our project, which is just outputting all our students onto our page. Okay, so our second challenge is going to be to create functionality for sorting our students, right? So right now, if we click on sort students, you can see that nothing happens, obviously, because we haven't written the code yet, right? So that's what we're going to do right now. So let's go back to our code. Now, where do we have our event listener for the sort button? It's right here, okay? So button, sort alphabetically. So this is what we need to be working with. And as you can imagine, our code here is going to be very similar to what we did here because we're still performing a GET request. The only thing we'll have to change is our URL, right? And you should probably know what we need to add here to be able to sort students from previous videos. So see if you can actually figure it out yourself what to write in here. Feel free to pause this video and try it out. And now let's do it together. So I'm actually just going to copy and paste this code. Okay, and let's add the ending here. So remember, to sort students alphabetically, all we have to do is enter a query parameter. I'm going to say question mark underscore sort equals name. So we're just going to do a very simple sort, which is by name and ascending, right? So let's go ahead and save this. And by the way, as you can probably guess, so we're calling here the same function, which means we're still using all this functionality that we wrote in here. But this time, instead of just pulling our student data, we're being more specific, right? So we're only pulling the students in this specific order. And so this time, this is the URL that's going to come through here, right? That's going to be accepted into here. And so our output now is still going to be our students, except in an alphabetical order. So that's the only difference. So let's save this file now. And if we go back, if you refresh, that's just how it's originally pulled. Now if we click on our sort button, there we go. They are now sorted alphabetically. So congratulations, task 2 is complete. Next, let's move on to filtering students. Alright guys, so right now our task is to create the filtering functionality here. So we already have the default display working. So we're fetching the students initially when the page loads, and we're also able to sort them alphabetically by clicking this button here. Now we want to be able to filter them. So right now, if we click on something here, like psychology, for example, nothing happens, right? Because we have not implemented the code for this yet. So let's do that right now. Let's just refresh and go back to our code. So we need to begin with our filter by major button, right? So we've already referenced this button here at the top. So button filter by major. So we're getting it from our DOM. And this is where we're going to write the code for it. So when we click the button, or rather, actually here it works a bit differently. It's not actually a click because this is actually a drop-down menu, right? So we call it a select menu in the HTML if you look here. Okay, so it's a select tag and it has options within it, right? So we cannot, using the word click would not be accurate. We should use change, okay, because that's the name of the correct event listener here, or the event rather. Okay, so first thing we need to be able to figure out is which value or which major is selected at any given time, right? So how do we do that? Well, let's just test it out first. So we're just going to type in console log, and what we want to log is event target value, right? Because if you look here, we're getting our event, so our change event here, and we want to see if we can correctly get the value of the target that's being changed, right? So let's just save this and go back to our project here, and we're going to go into the developer tools here. So the shortcut that I'm using is Control Shift and I. We have our console open, and let's see if this works. So if we click psychology, you can see we have psychology here. If you click kinesiology, we have kinesiology, etc., etc. So everything works here. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. So let's exit from here now. So we're getting our value. Now, what we want to do is we want to pass this value into our URL that we're going to fetch. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, let's actually, instead of console logging this, we're going to put it into a variable, right? So let's say constant, I'm going to call it major equals event target value, right? So we're now storing our the name of our major into this variable called major. Now, can you guess what we need to do next? Well, we need to call our function, right? So we're going to call the same function that we called here, fetch students, except we're going to pass in a different URL this time. So let's just, I guess I could copy this one, why not? Paste it in here. Okay, and might as well make it tight here. Good. So how do we need to alter our URL? Well, if you recall, we need to do another query string. This time we're going to say major equals to. Now, here, this is the tricky part, right? Because we cannot just hard code some kind of major here. For example, if we just typed in like major equals psychology, for example, well, that would kind of defeat our purpose of getting the value of our drop down, right? Because, well, let's actually see what this gives us. So if we save this, can you guess what we're going to get with this URL? Let's see. Click psychology. Well, we're getting psychology, so that looks good so far, right? But what if we click kinesiology? Well, we're still getting psychology, right? We click biology, we're still getting psychology. So we're always getting only the psychology students because we've hard-coded psychology into our URL, right? So we don't want to do that. So we need to dynamically output our major. So how do we do that? Well, if you remember, we actually did this earlier when we were creating our function here, the fetch students function. So remember, we're using this template literals here, and then we were able to insert a variable here dynamically. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. Okay, so let's go back. Let's change the quotes to template literals. Perfect. And instead of psychology, we're going to open our variable template, and we're going to say major. So now, whatever major our user selects from the drop-down menu is going to be passed into our URL, so that when we get to here, to this function, we're only fetching the students with that major, right? That's exactly what we want. Okay, so let's save this. And let's hope it all works. Let's go back to test it out. So now we click on psychology, we get psychology students. Click on kinesiology, we get kinesiology, biology, and chemistry. Perfect. Works like a charm. All right, task number 3 is complete. Now let's move on to the next one. All right, so far we've only been doing GET requests, and I think we should stick with this. So there's one more functionality that we'll need to implement with GET requests, which is going to be the student details pop-up, right? So right now, if we click on student details, nothing happens, right? So this is what we need to fix right now. So let's go to our code. So we have an event listener attached to the student list. First thing I'm going to have to do here is we're going to have to actually write a little conditional statement to make sure that whatever we click is the button. So how do we do that? Well, let me write it out and then I'll explain it. So we're going to say so we're saying if the target of our event, so the target of whatever we click, has a class name of details button, which ensures that we're actually clicking on our details button. Now, what do we want to do when that happens? Well, first, let's just test to make sure that the button click works. So let's just console log. I'm going to say hello. Oops. Save that. Go back here. Let's open our terminal here. Okay, our console rather. So if we click here now, we should see a message hello here. Let's see. There we go. It works for every single one of our buttons. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. So let's go back to our code. So instead of console logging something here, what we actually want to do is, well, we want to open a model. Okay. But I think, okay, let's open the model first. We might change some things around later, but let's do model student details. Remember, this is the one we already referenced to here. So we have it's one of our models, right? Model student details. We're going to say style visibility equals to visible. So after clicking the button, we're basically saying that our model should become visible, so it should appear. So let's save this. Do we get anything right now? We do, right? So obviously there's nothing here, but we do have our model that shows up, which is perfect. Okay, let's go back. Now, what else do we need to do? Well, do you remember earlier when we were putting out our template and I told you that we were doing something tricky here. We were putting a paragraph with a hidden attribute, so it doesn't show up in the visible part. And then we were putting our student ID here. So right now we're actually going to reference this, okay? Because our goal right now is to get the ID of the student, because we're going to need this information to then make a fetch request to that particular student. So let's go ahead and do that. Here we go. We're going to say constant ID equals to e target parent element dot query selector class of ID. And then I'm going to say inner text. Now, this looks a little bit complicated, but essentially what we're doing here is we're creating a constant or a variable called ID, and then what we're putting inside that variable is eTarget parent element, so the parent element of our target, and then we're looking for a query. We're doing query selector of ID, so we're looking for a class of ID, and then we're getting the inner text of that. So essentially, we're looking for this, right? This is the class of ID, and the inner text will be our actual ID. So right now, just to make sure that this works, let's again console log it. Try to console log in the ID. So save. Let's open our console. So right now, if we click here, we see the ID of 1. Now, we still get the model still open, so it's a little bit annoying, but that's okay. Don't worry about that for now. Let's just make sure our IDs show up. So here we have ID of 2, Brendan, and ID of 3, Sarah, etc., etc. So basically, as you can see, we're successfully getting the ID of whatever student we click on, which is what we want. Okay? Good. So, what do we do with this? Well, now that we have this ID, we can once again make a fetch request, right? And then we can enter the appropriate ID into it. Now, if you recall from our previous videos, to get information on a specific student, do you remember what we need to put in our URL? See if you can pause this video and figure out what our URL is actually going to be. All right, now I'm going to show you how to do it. So let's type in fetch student details. Now notice we don't actually have this function yet. We are going to create it soon. We're not using the functions that we used here, fetch students, right? And the reason for that is because I want to output a different template here. Remember, our template for fetch students is this one. It only has student name, major, and that's it, right? And just the student details button. But what we want to output now is we want to output the details of the student. So we want to put the name, we want to put the major, email, and year of birth. So we want all this information. For that reason, we're going to create a special separate function for it. But for now, let's just write the name of that function. And here, again, we're going to use template literals. And let's actually copy this to make things quicker. Paste it. And here at the end, I'm not sure if you guessed or not, we're going to say ID, and we don't need this query parameter. All we need is a /. So there we go. This should work. Now, it's not going to work just yet because we haven't created this function yet. So let's do that next. So fetch student details function. We have it right over here. So let's write our code in here. So the beginning is going to look very similar to this. In fact, we can even go ahead and copy these few lines instead of typing them out. Okay, so, and we're going to go ahead and actually change this to template literals. And we're going to start entering our template here, HTML template. So what I want to do for the details is I want to output a paragraph. We're actually going to have 4 paragraphs. So everything is going to be in its own paragraph. And let's use a strong tag for the student name. So we're just to make it kind of bold and stand out a little bit. So we're going to say name. And then we're going to dynamically output the name of our student. So student dot name. Okay, and I think that's looking good. Let's see here. Oh, I did notice one mistake. I put students here, and here I put students. So we need to keep this consistent. We're gonna use student. Okay, and now this all looks right. Perfect. Okay, so let's review what we did here. So if we go back to our event listener, remember, so we checked if the target of our click has a class of details button, right? And then we opened our model. So we're setting the model to visible, and then we're getting our ID from our hidden paragraph, and then we're calling our function to display the data for that student. Okay, so there we go. Now I think it might be a bit better if we actually put the modal here afterwards at the end. Let's try that. Okay, and then, so here we're basically getting the data first, then we're making the model visible. I think that's going to be a little better in terms of functionality. Good, so let's save that. And let's test it out. So we're gonna go back to our project and let's click on student details for Carolyn Mayer. And it's not working. Why is it not working? Let's see what's happening here. So we have student's ID, student details. Oh, right. Well, that's a little bit silly of us because we need to actually output this somewhere, right? So this HTML needs to be output somewhere, just like we did here, right? We output our HTML in this student list. So, but here we need to output it into our details box. So details box, that's the one right here that we selected. So let's go down here and type in details box. And this is the box that's going to appear in our modal, right? Equals HTML. Perfect. So let's save this and let's try this again. Okay, so here we go. Nice. Everything's working perfectly. Now, if you wanted to, you could put a little space between these. Actually, I'm just going to do that right now, just so it looks better. So we're going to say, we can actually put it right here. Just so it looks a little bit nicer. Save that. Let's check. Much better. Okay, so we're getting data for Brendan with email, year of birth, and basically all his details. Sarah, nice. Peter, beautiful. Stephanie. Excellent. All right, guys, so the next thing we're going to work on is the delete functionality. So as you can see right now, when we click on the X's, it does not work. Our student is not deleted. So this is what we're going to implement next. So let's go back to our code. Now, we want to start here with this event listener. Now, you notice this event listener is actually on the student list, which is the container, right? So this is the container that we have here of all our students. And we're using a very similar method that we used here for the details, right? So we were setting the event listener on the student list, and then we were checking if whatever we click on has a particular class name. So in this case, the class name we were checking for was details button. And in this case, we're going to have to check for a class name of the delete button, which if we go up here to our HTML, it's this one here. Okay, so remember when we put out our HTML, we have the span tag with class delete students. So this is going to be our delete button. So let's go back here. So I guess our code here is going to be very similar to this. So let's actually, well, we could copy and paste it, but let me just write it out. It's not that much to write. So we're going to do a conditional. I'm going to say if our click target, so e target class name equals to delete students, right? Is it students or student? I have to check. Students. Okay, plural. Okay, so what do we want to do in this case? Well, we want to, first of all, we still want to get our student ID, right? We still need that because if you think about it, to make a delete request, if you recall from our previous videos in this series, we still need to pass in the ID of the student that we want to delete in the URL, right? So we're going to be using the exact same URL here. So let's actually, yeah, we could copy this, paste it in here. Perfect. So we're getting our student ID, and then we're including it in our URL, right? Dynamically outputting it. And then here, the only thing we have to change is we don't want to run this function anymore. We're going to run a function that we had prepared here called add or delete student. Now, don't worry about the add part yet. We haven't done that functionality yet. Later on, I will explain this part. But for now, let's just use this name. Okay, so let's say add or delete student. Perfect. Okay, so now we need to actually implement our function, right? So we're passing in the URL with the ID into this function, and in here we're taking in the URL. Now, don't worry about this yet. This is for the adding the student. So just not to confuse you, I'm going to get rid of this for now. And what do we want to do in here? Well, we want to perform a delete request, right? So we're going to say here, fetch to the URL that's passed in. And now here we have to do something a bit different than we have been doing so far with our GET requests, because here we're going to have to include two things, a method and headers. So let's open up curly brackets here, or braces. And we're going to say method is going to be delete. And then for our headers, we're going to say content type colon application JSON. Oops. Good. Why is this underlined? Oh, that's because we need to include this in another set of curly braces. Just like that, and there we go. All right, so this is the headers part is really important. If we don't include this, our request is not going to work. Okay, so this is just something we have to include whenever we have a delete request. Good, so this is looking nice. Now let's see if this is working. We're going to save. And let's go back here. So let's try to delete Stephanie. So let's click on X. And perfectly, she's gone. And of course, I could do this with Peter as well. So it'll work with all of our students. And by the way, if you want to return the data you just deleted, you can go to your db.json and you can just click here. Well, I click Control Z to undo, right? And it's going to automatically return the deleted students. So that's a nice little shortcut to know. And as you can see, well, we have to save it. And now they're going to be back. Okay. Perfect. So our delete functionality is now complete, and we have one more thing left to do here, and that is to implement the add student functionality. So let's do that next. All right, so we come to our final task now in this project, which is to add a student. Now, I kind of saved the best for last, as they say. This is probably going to be the more complicated functionality out of the ones that we've done so far, but it's going to be, I'm sure, very interesting and fun to do. So right now, as you can see, when we click on this button, all we get is a form, right, that we have to fill out. So let's just fill it out as an example. So if we click this right now, you can see nothing happens, right? So that's because we have not set it up yet. So let's go ahead and code it. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is go to our event listener for the add button. So let's see, where do we have that? Right here, add a student form submit, right? So this is the button that's on our form, right? So this one here, that's this button right here, okay? So what do we want to do when we click that button? Well, several things. So let's start typing here. So first thing we want to do is we want to do something called a prevent default on our event. So normally, as you saw when I was just showing it, when we clicked on the submit button, it actually refreshed our whole page. That's because that is the default behavior that happens when we submit a form. Now we want to prevent that. So let me just show you once again. So if you go here, click submit. Well, we do need to put some content here. Let me just do something quickly. Okay, if you click submit, we get a refresh, and that's it. So we want to be able to get rid of this default behavior. So to do that, we're going to say E, which is our event that we take in here, and we're going to say prevent default, just like that. And if we click on this, or rather if we check this now, you can see that it doesn't refresh anymore, right? We still have the click event, but it doesn't refresh our page. This is exactly what we wanted. Okay, so let's get rid of that. And under here, we can continue coding. So what do we want to do now? Well, to be able to add a new student, we first of all need to be able to get the values from our form, right? So all of this information, name, email, year of birth, major, we want to be able to get a reference to that information. So let's do that first. We're going to create a student object. So we're going to say let student, could use const as well, student equals. Okay, and let's type in our object here. So we're going to give our object a property of name. Now, where are we going to get this name from? Well, if you think about it, our form has a name. So if you look up here, we gave the name of form add student. Okay, so it's referencing the form. And in here, so if you look in here, add student model, this is our form, right? We have for each of the inputs, we have an ID of the appropriate input. So for example, for the name, we have an ID of name. For the email, we have ID of email, year of birth, major, etc., etc. So this is going to help us here because it's going to help us actually get the value from the form. So what we're going to do in the code is, so we're going to say that the name is equal to, let's reference our form first, form add student dot name. All right, so that's where we're using the ID, and we're going to say dot value because we want to actually get the value out of that input, right? And we're going to do the same thing for email. Okay, so we created our student object here. Now we can check if this is working. So again, let's console log student here. Save that. Go back here. So if everything is working, we should see our student object show up here, right? So let's see if that works. Perfect. Okay, so we're getting our student object output here, so it's working just as we wanted. Let's exit and go back here. Okay, perfect. So we got our student object. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to actually reference or run our function here. So we're going to run a function that we already did right here, add or delete student. So remember, we're doing two things in the same function. Here we're deleting the student, and we're also going to use the same function for adding a student. So let's just type add or delete student. And in here, again, we're going to pass our URL. So for the URL, we're going to say http localhost 3000 / students, right? So we're just going to our resource name, students. Now, another thing we need to do here, which is important, and by the way, we didn't really need backticks here. We could have just used quotes. We're not going to be inserting anything dynamic here. And the other thing we need to pass in here is our student object, right? Because that's what we're going to be adding. So let's pass that in as a second argument here. I'm going to say student, and that's it. So that should be it for this event listener. Let's save this. And now we're going to have to modify our function a little bit. So if you recall from the previous lesson that we did, right now this function is only deleting a student because that's what we've done so far, right? But we need to add the add functionality to it as well. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to make it so that it accepts two arguments. So it already accepts URL. We also want it to accept the student object, right? So we're going to say, let's call it student object. We can call it whatever we want, but just to be clear, we'll call it student object because that's what it is. And the next thing we're going to do is, let's just make some space here. So what I'd like to do is I want to check whatever is going through this function, whether it's going to be delete request or an add student request, right? Since we are going to be doing both of these functionalities in here. So how do we do that? Well, there's several ways. The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to use conditional. All right, so I'm going to say this: if URL and student object. So what does this mean? It means if we're passing in both the URL and the student object into this function, that means we want to do code between these braces, right? So I'm gonna leave a comment here. I'm gonna say this is an add student request, and here we're gonna write the code for adding a student. So we're still going to fetch. So it's going to be very similar to this. We're going to fetch the URL that's passed in. So URL. And once again, we need to open curly braces. We're going to add a method. This time it's going to be a post method. Oops. We are going to add our headers just like we did here. Let's just copy this, paste it in here. And the third thing we're going to have to add is our actual student data, right? So the data that's being passed on through here. So the way we're going to do that, we're going to say body, and here we're going to have to use special methods. So let me just write it first. So we're saying JSON.stringify and then passing in our student object. So what this does, it converts our JavaScript object into basically JSON, right? Which is what our JSON server needs to be able to read it. Okay, so that's done, and that is looking good. Now, we do need to add something else here. So we said that if we receive two parameters here, URL and student object, we want to run whatever's in here, correct? But if we just receive a URL, just one parameter, then we know it's going to be a delete request. So we want to run the code in here. Okay, so let's just add here an else. Let's say else. I'm going to open curly braces, and then we're just going to paste this between these. Perfect. Okay, so everything is looking good. Hopefully we did everything right, and let's just check it to see if it works. So let's go back. Just quickly check here. There don't seem to be any errors, so that's a good sign. So first of all, let's delete a student again to make sure the delete functionality is still working. So perfect, that's working. And now instead of Stephanie, we're going to add another student, right? So let's add our James Bond. Okay, fingers crossed. Perfect, it worked. Let's add another student. I'm gonna say submit, and there we go. So excellent. Let's delete them again, and we can do this as much as we want. So let's just review again what we did here, just so you're clear about the code. Going back to our event listener. So we're referencing our add student form, right? We're preventing the default action of refreshing the page. Then we're entering our, well, we're starting a student object, right? So putting that into a variable, and we're giving it a properties and a value, right? So the properties are name, email, year of birth, and major, and the value we're pulling from the actual form. Next, we're activating our function. So we're calling our function, add or delete student, and into that function, we're passing in two arguments. The first one is the URL, and the second one is the student object that we created right here. Next, we go to that function, which is right here. We're saying, okay, so if the function receives two arguments, URL and student object, we want to run this code in here. Else, if it's just one argument, we want to run this code. I should probably add here comment this as well, just to keep it consistent. This is a delete request, right? Okay, so if we have only one argument, we know it's a delete request. If it's two, we know it's a post request. And for the post request, we're taking in the two arguments. We're doing a fetch to the URL that's passed in here, and then we're including an object with a method, so a property of a method, post, headers, content type, application JSON, same thing we had here. And then here we're also including the body, right, which is the student data. And that's it. And all of this worked successfully. So that means we are done with our project. And hopefully you learned something interesting here. Hopefully you're more comfortable now with the JSON server, and you can see the value that it can bring us as web developers in testing our app. So good luck in your journey with JSON server, and I will see you in another video.